Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. This is Horror Trans. I am a transgender woman, and I talk about all things horror, and this is episode 11 of the Horror Trans podcast. So, um, no housekeeping at the moment. Still doing videos on schedule, or at least trying to. Now, I do have a minor update on this week's Patreon video. I tried to record it using OBS so I could get the picture in picture so you could watch along with me as I watched the movie. But when I set up the encoder, I picked the wrong encoder and the audio came out garbled, so the video file was useless. So I apologize, there will not be a Patreon video this week. So I apologize for that. I know I screwed up last week's Patreon video, so I am sorry. That's 2 weeks in a row. I think the next one, I'm just going to do it the way I'm used to doing it, the way I used to do it, because that seemed to work. Okay, so I always start the show off with what have I watched recently. And I kind of want to do a what am I interested in or what's coming up, but I'm not ready to do that yet because I got to do some thinking. But I watched 4 things the last 2 weeks. I watched Amityville Horror, The Evil Escapes, which is part 4 in the original franchise. Now, this is the one I tried to do the commentary of, and I screwed up. Now, last weekend, I watched the WWE Royal Rumble. I may have already talked about that on the last podcast, but I don't remember. Last night, I watched the Super Bowl, and my Kansas City Chiefs took home another trophy and some rings and accolades, and I'm happy because it was a nail biter. That fourth quarter was giving me heartburn. And then, also this past week, I watched the movie Hostel, which the review of that is coming as soon as I get done recording this. I'll start uploading. So that's everything I remember watching. I'm pretty sure I watched something else, but I just can't remember. I need to start writing things down as I watch them. Oh yeah, I watched Species 2, which I did try to live stream earlier in the week, or last week, but that didn't go so well. So I do have some news and rumors, so let's go ahead and pull those up. First, coming from Bloody Disgusting. Actually, I forgot to look for news stories, so let's go ahead and scroll. Alright, 4 new horror movies releasing on Friday, February 9th. That's a week old. Hot Pink Horror and The Color of Feminine Rage. I don't know what that is. So I'm not seeing anything noteworthy on Bloody Disgusting. They did drop the trailer for Twisters last night during the Super Bowl. And I suppose I could do a reaction to that real quick. Let's go ahead and watch the trailer and react. So, 1990s Twister classic, Disaster Class, finally gets a sequel this summer. Where's the video? Here it is. Official trailer. I like that poster. It's very reminiscent to the original. Warner Brothers. Amblin Entertainment. That's interesting. Oh shit, that's loud. Oh my god. That was loud. Okay, so... Oh shit. Very reminiscent of the original movie. Looks like we're seeing. Oh, this is a modern minivan or SUV. That's a giant twister. Doing the thing you're not supposed to do. Ooh, the classic font comes back. Small town. Cowboy hillbillies. Ooh, I love that truck. They need to get Matthew McConaughey for this movie. Jesus. Missed opportunity. Wait, is this going to pull a Sharknado where they blow up a tornado? Jesus Christ, I'm already tapping out. That better not be the plot. Is that a drone plane? Oh shit. It does look like it's going to top the original, at least in terms of destruction. Probably better special effects, too. In theaters July. I will be seeing that for sure. Alright, so that's all we got from Bloody Disgusting. Next we have, let's look at Dread Central. Oh yeah, Goosebumps is getting season 2, so that's interesting. I did read the article, I just saw the tweet. I'm not seeing anything newsy on Dread Central. Looks like this is all old news. I must have read this all already. Alright, let's look at horrornews.net. I don't like this page. It jumps. It doesn't scroll. I do not like that. Fix your code, Horror News. I'm probably going to stop looking at them. Let's look at Joe Blow. Da-da-da-da. Horror movie news. Monstrosity. Looks like it's a pseudo remake-ish of Monster Squad. Or is this talking about Monster Squad? Let's open this up and see what this is. Monstrosity, a werewolf, a vampire, a zombie, and a Frankenstein's monster guard a Hellgate. Rob Zombie feature remake? What the fuck? Okay, producer-director Robert Ripberger recently wrapped production on the sci-fi thriller Renner, which sees Frankie Muniz and Violet Bean taking on a manipulative AI. Blah, 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 blah. The first project in the lineup being a horror thriller creature feature called Monstrosity, which is reminiscent of the classic sitcom The Munsters. Okay, never mind. Fuck that. Not interested. Nothing new. Nothing since February 10th on Joe Blow. So let's get out of here. iHorror.com. Date movies for the horror-loving couple. That's one of their features. I'm not going to read it. Wicked Part 1 official first look trailer releases. Yes, I did see that trailer last night. Cinderella's Revenge horror film slashing into theaters this April. Okay, that looks cool. Neon Noir unveils Brute 1976, a homage to horror classics. Blah, blah, blah. Jurassic World 4 loses its director David Leitch, however you say that. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, let's look at horrorsociety.com. Just a bunch of DVD releases, nothing newsy. HorrorBuzz.com. Just movie reviews. Okay. Screen Rant. Horror movies. Best horror movies on Netflix. That's their opinion. Not seeing anything on Screen Rant. And that's all I have for news and rumors. So I guess just Twisters is the big story. And I can't wait to see it. Now I know Twisters is technically a disaster film, but I still lump them into the horror family. I grew up in Tornado Alley, so tornadoes are legit fucking terrifying. Alright, let's get into our topics. First topic I've been putting off for a while because I wanted to do some more research because I was fuzzy on the definition. I've seen, the topic is Giallo. I've seen a number of Dario Argento films that are classified as Giallo, but I never really understood what was the difference between a Giallo and just like a traditional slasher or torture porn. So according to Wikipedia, there are subtle differences. So Giallo, according to Wikipedia, is a genre of murder mystery that often contains slasher, thriller, psychological horror, sexploitation, and sometimes supernatural horror elements. Now, from what I have seen from Dario Argento, he checks like most of those boxes. So according to this, Giallo films are generally characterized as gruesome murder mystery thrillers that combine the suspense elements of detective fiction with shocking horror, excessive bloodletting, stylish camera work, and jarring musical arrangements. The archetypal Giallo plot involves a mysterious black-gloved psychopathic killer who stalks and butchers a series of beautiful women. While most films in the genre involve a human killer, some also feature a supernatural element. Okay, so let's see if I can find a list of movies. Film. Let's just look at... I'm going to skip over the 60s. Let's just look at the 70s. We've got a lot of Dario Argento, it looks like. Pretty much, his name is plastered everywhere. So, he's the name that I think of when I hear Giallo. Most of these people, I'm not even going to attempt to say their names because I do not speak Italian. I do not read Latin or Italian. So I don't know how to say these names. But it looks like most of the Giallo films I have seen were 70s and 80s. So that's... I don't know. This wasn't a very well thought out topic, which is why I have a bunch of topics this week because I didn't know how far I was going to get. My opinion of Giallo is it's basically more or less just the Italian slasher, more or less. Because slashers do typically have murder mystery elements. Not always, but a lot of times. Especially in the ones where you either don't know who the killer is, or if you do know who the killer is, you don't really fully understand their motivation, which is pretty common in slashers. So that still provides a little bit of a mystery element. Plus, there's always the who dies next and who's the final girl. Just scrolling through that Wikipedia list, I have only seen 3 movies in my life that Wikipedia classifies as Giallo. So I'm going to tap out and say I don't have enough experience with the genre to commentate on it any further. However, I can talk about this next topic quite a bit. This is sex and sexuality in horror. So we're going to talk about nudity, gratuitous sex, and sexuality as represented in horror. Now, a lot of horror is misogynistic, and almost all horror, as with all movies, are victims, if you will, or circumstance of the patriarchy. So sex, as presented in the vast majority of horror, is women are sexualized and men are pigs. This is not always the case, but quite often what you have is female nudity and what's referred to as the male gaze. And if you get male nudity, it's usually just butt cheeks, and it's usually like for a quick flash and then you're done. Whereas women will get naked, full frontal, long ass scenes. Now, the slasher subgenre is notorious for having a lot of gratuitous nudity. In fact, it's a trope. The people who have sex, the teenagers who have premarital sex in these movies, are often victims of the killer, which is usually a force of nature represented by a human monster or serial killer. Now, the 80s were real big with sex in movies, not just horror. So there were a lot of naked boobs in the 80s. The 90s sort of moved away from that for a little bit. And then we, I think, overcorrected in the 2000s when torture porn came on the scene with movies like Hostel and Turistas and some others. So my estimation of what most likely happened is in the 90s, we just went no nudity, and people bitched so much that there were no nudity in the 90s horror that we overcorrected and went full-blown torture porn halfway to Porn Town in the 2000s. Now, there are a handful of case studies where I want to talk about sexuality as represented in horror. The first one I want to talk about, I've talked about on the channel, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. You've heard of this as the gay Freddy, the gay Elm Street. There's a whole documentary on it called Scream King or something like that. Or My Scream Queen or something like that. I don't know. Anyways, this has been talked to death, but as a queer woman who saw this movie and picked up on the queer undertones as a child, because this movie was a part of my sexual awakening, I can talk about it. So, you have very little nudity in this movie. Well, okay, I take that back. You have very little full frontal female nudity in this movie. You have a lot of naked guy butt. A lot in this movie. You even have a shower scene where a naked man is murdered, butt out. And they actually smack his butt with a towel to the point where it becomes red. So this is obviously an allusion to sexual assault that happened, the coach assaulting Jesse, the boy, and him getting revenge, which I believe is where the word revenge in Freddy's Revenge comes in. I believe. Because otherwise the movie doesn't make sense, because Freddy doesn't get revenge on any of the survivors of the first film, but I've already talked about this in other videos. The second horror movie that I think tackles sexuality really well, that is a horror movie, is Ginger Snaps. Now, Ginger Snaps isn't focused so much on sexual awakening so much as it is female sexual development, specifically puberty and the main character getting her first period simultaneously as she's turning into a werewolf. So there's a lot of allegory with her turning into a werewolf, a beast of passion, and becoming a full-fledged woman, a creature, human of passion. And she does pretty much rape a guy in the movie, more or less. He does verbally consent to have sex, but not as violently as she does, and he repeatedly asks her to knock it off. So I'm counting that as a rape. The next movie that is a more modern horror movie that tackles sexuality really well is a movie I did review. I have mixed feelings on. I may have given it a harsh review because of my pagan views, but as a queer woman and as a female identifying individual, I relate to this movie, and this is Jennifer's Body. This movie, like Ginger Snaps, it's pretty much the same story, just I think a little more fully developed and fleshed out. But you could argue that there are some homosexual undertones in this movie because I believe her best friend in the movie has a crush on her and very decidedly rejects her boyfriend to pursue Jennifer. So I would argue that's a budding lesbian relationship. Now, I will get into the male gaze and gratuitous nudity or sex in a future video, in another, either a podcast or a topic video down the road. But for the purposes of this discussion, so this podcast doesn't get too long, I'm just going to say that looking at things like Midsommar and Jennifer's Body and some other more modern horror movies, I think we as a society, as horror fans and filmmakers alike, have come a long way in giving female voices as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Cillian Murphy hanging dong in 28 Days Later, because all the ladies wanted to see that dick. Not just the ladies. I'm sure there are gay men and non-binary individuals that probably were happy to see his dong in that movie. So we have definitely come a long way, at least since the 70s and 80s. The 90s are kind of, I classify the 90s as a lost era for horror. Horror was not taken seriously in the 80s, so we overcorrected in the 90s by making either just leaning into the B nature and the schlock of the 90s by making rubbish films, or we went too artsy and made films that are questionable if they're even horror or thrillers, like Silence of the Lambs, Seven, movies like that. There are others. The Sixth Sense, I think, falls into that category, and other movies of that era. It really took Scream to give us a legit, financially successful, high-quality, viable horror slasher franchise that had no female nudity in it. In fact, it barely has any sex in it. I think the first one has a sex scene that happens off camera, and I don't think any of the others have sex or even bring it up, really, other than to state it as one of the rules. If you bone, you die. I am okay with Friday the 13th levels of nudity in my films. I am not okay with hostile levels of nudity in my films. And I'm going to be honest, the sexual content of Midsommar was very uncomfortable for me. Keeping in mind, I'm aware of the differences between the theatrical cut and the director's cut, but that 3 hour theatrical cut was a goddamn slog to get through. There's no chance in hell I'm ever gonna watch a 4 hour director's cut. That ain't happening. It'll take me a week to try to watch that fucking thing. This is why I don't watch Lord of the Rings movies. It just takes too goddamn long. But anyways, that's all I have to say about sex and horror and nudity and horror. Moving on, I want to talk about a TV show that was instrumental in my appreciation of horror, as is a lot of people's appreciation of horror. Now, the TV show is Twilight Zone, and I'm talking about the original one from the 60s. It is more accurate to classify it as sci-fi horror, but it's still horror. And I like the Twilight Zone in that they're like mini feature films. Each episode is like a self-contained horror movie. And I love that. My personal favorite episode of the Twilight Zone, and I'm only going to tell you what happens at the end, so spoiler. It's the episode where the man is in a library and there are no people left on Earth, and he's just relieved to be the last human alive, and he's in a library, and then his glasses break and blister his eyes so he can't read, and that's fucking like scary, but also like hell yeah, that's what I want to see. Now I know the Twilight Zone was a major influence on horror filmmakers of the 80s, but also TV filmmakers of the 80s and 90s, specifically the X-Files. Now, I know they did make a Twilight Zone, the movie, sometime in the middle of the 80s. I don't remember the exact year, 85, 86, thereabouts, which I've already done my review of. Pretty good movie. Does capture the spirit and the essence of the series. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the Twilight Zone is allegedly, supposedly, partially inspiration for James Cameron's The Terminator, which some try to argue is a slasher. I'm not convinced, but I could be convinced if someone made a compelling argument without using condescending language. Because everyone who says it's a slasher movie insults everyone who doesn't see it. And I don't like that. Like, no, if you see it and I don't, like, share your reasoning with me so I can see it. Don't just insult me for not seeing it. Excuse me, sorry, I had to hack something up, and that was gross. I am coming down with a cold, I think. I had a stuffy nose and a sore throat, which is not good. Anyways, if you haven't seen the original Twilight Zone, definitely check it out. They're very reminiscent of the time they were made. My second favorite one is where there's an alien invasion, or a suburban neighborhood believes there's an alien invasion, and the entire neighborhood turns on everybody else with "you're an alien," "no, you're an alien," and they just all end up killing each other. Pretty dystopian. Pretty dark. I love it. Moving on. I'm going to save this for a more in-depth study, maybe a topical video down the road. But today I'm going to touch on briefly the differences between CGI and optical effects and practical effects. Now, a lot of people use the word CGI when referring to when referring to optical effects, which is not accurate. Ghostbusters, the original 1984, uses optical effects, not CGI. Now, what's the difference? You can Google. But briefly, optical effects are effects that are done in camera using tricks. So, like trick lighting, or trick mirrors, or things like that, or just drawing in frames of animation over the top of the live action. Sometimes high quality animation, but it is traditional cell animation, not computer generated imagery. Now, there was some early, very early CGI in the 80s, but it was experimental, brand new technology used sparingly because it was very expensive. So a lot of times people today will see an optical shot in an 80s horror movie and incorrectly attribute it as CGI when it is not CGI, but it is also not technically practical. So, now, why am I talking about CGI versus practical? Because there's this belief, which I'm going to call it a myth, I'm going to bust it a little bit, that practical is always good, CGI is always bad. And then people always are shocked when practical holds up, and always like dismissive whenever CGI holds up. However, there are some examples of practical effects in the 80s, which is the golden age of practical, that don't hold up. The number one example I have is Evil Dead 2. That stop motion looks like rubbish. Even the stop motion, obviously the stop motion in Evil Dead 1 looks like shit because that was a fucking no budget movie. But Evil Dead 2 stop motion still looks like shit compared to the CGI we saw in Terminator 2 just a couple of years later, and Lord of the Rings roughly a decade or so later, or even in The Matrix. And I know neither of those are horror, but horror fans in particular tend to be religious, cultish even, about they need practical in their horror, and they're allergic to CGI. And I'm not a fan of that. I think they both have their uses if done right. And I'm not going to say CGI needs to be used sparingly. Jesus Christ, if the whole movie's CGI and it looks good, fuck off. If it looks good, it looks good. Who cares? I have other non-horror examples of shitty CGI from shitty practical from the 80s. The monster, the dragon or whatever from the movie The Barbarians, looks like a literal fucking rubber mask. It looks like a rubber monster. It looks like shit. So those are examples of the golden age of practical that don't hold up. I can also find examples of CGI that do hold up. But I'm not going to sit here and do this film by film or shot by shot or whatever. Most horror fans that I've interacted with tend to have a view that is, do it practically as much as you can and then do CGI to enhance the shot as needed. Now, I know the Final Destination films took this approach, at least in the first two, and then they just went pretty much full-blown CGI for the low-budget sequels because it was diminishing returns. They weren't making as much money, so they didn't spend as much. But there are plenty of examples of horror movies where CGI looks good. A lot of people shit on CGI Blood, but that 2013 Evil Dead is one of the best looking movies I've ever seen, and I believe some of those shots are CGI. Don't quote me on this, but that's what I've been told. Another example that comes to my mind is Deathgasm. Deathgasm is a very low budget movie that couldn't have been done practically with the budget they had. It wouldn't have looked good had they not used CGI. I definitely think CGI works better today than it did in the 90s. But let's look at the Leprechauns as examples of practical done wrong. Now, I know those are technically B movies and they're supposed to be low budget. But come on. Don't ever come at me with practical always equals good, CGI always equals bad. No, I take the stance that either technique can be used at the filmmaker's discretion, and it's nobody's goddamn business. If the shot looks good, the shot looks good. I don't give a fuck how they did it, as long as it looks good. I hate when people say, oh, it looked good, but as soon as I found out it was CGI, it took me out of the movie. Fuck off. It didn't take you out of the movie, except for you having an unrealistic bias. For every good-looking practical effect like The Thing, I can find plenty of examples of shitty practical effects. Case in point, the entire Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child. Nothing looks good in that movie. Except maybe the motorcycle scene. That's it. The rest of it looks like garbage. But Freddy vs. Jason, which is a movie horror fans universally love, is almost all CGI. So there is that. Now, devil's advocate, when the shot looks like shit, I don't care if it's practical or CGI. If it looks like shit, it looks like shit. I'm going to call it out. For example, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010, the remake, that CGI coming out of the wall shot looks like garbage. Whereas the original shot that did the same thing looked fucking awesome. So there is that. However, we're at a time now where practical is more expensive than CGI. And for low budget, you have no choice. You got to do what you got to do. You know what I mean? As long as it looks good, I don't care how it was done. One shot, I know this is sci-fi, not horror, but one shot people always point to that is their proof CGI looks like ass is the 2005 Fantastic Four, where Mr. Fantastic is melting, and everyone's like, that looks like garbage, and that's CGI. It isn't. They made a wax statue and melted it. That's a practical shot done in 2005. So that's proof practical can look like ass even in modern times. So there you go. Now, do I personally advocate for filmmakers going back a la George Lucas Special Edition and touching up special effects from films that have already been released? My stance is that's up to the filmmaker, because you, viewer, have a choice to purchase that copy or watch it or not. Now, as long as they don't go the George Lucas route where they destroy the originals to create the enhanced version, I'm okay with them both existing simultaneously. So if Sam Raimi wanted to go back and touch up the special effects of The Evil Dead 2, and Army of Darkness with CGI, I'm going to say go for it, dude, if that's what he wants to do. Because the stop motion in Evil Dead looks like garbage, and you're never going to convince me otherwise. And if you don't think it looks like garbage, you're just emotionally biased, probably because of nostalgia, is my guess. I'm not saying 100%, I'm not judging. I'm just saying that's my hypothesis. So the burden's on you to prove me otherwise. All right, let's talk about the modern renaissance of horror. Now, I'm of the mindset that the so-called golden age of anything doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a golden age. The golden age is a mythological concept of a prehistorical period where everything was amazing, and then everything that came after was not. So people like to point to the so-called golden age of comics as the best period of comics. I disagree. Some people like to say the 30s is the so-called golden age of horror. I disagree. To me, the golden age refers to the value. Where do we get the most value from our horror? What was the movies that made the most impact on us culturally? And I would argue that's the 80s. Those Universal monsters are remembered fondly and did influence a generation of filmmakers. But let's be honest, they're mostly forgotten. Every time they try to reboot the Universal monsters, they flop. And they flop hard because audiences are like, I don't want to watch those old fuddy-duddies. They're not scary. Dracula's not scary. The Mummy's not scary. The Invisible Man's not scary. So, I'm not saying the Universal movies suck. I'm saying they are not the golden age. They're just sort of proto-horror. Anyways, the Renaissance, to me, started around 2009-ish. And some of the early examples I have of the Renaissance would be the Saw films, Oculus, eventually leading us up to The Purge, The Strangers, and leading us to what we have recently with things like Midsommar and Hereditary and A Quiet Place, etc. I would say that horror as a genre is more financially successful now than it's ever been, and it's more viable as a form of artistic expression now than it has ever been. Because, believe it or not, those Universal monster movies were popular because there was nothing else. Nothing came before. They were like the first to do that. And they were at a time where Hollywood was still, experimenting and trying new things. Well, not like today, where by and large, Hollywood, especially blockbusters, are just sequels, reboots, rehashes, and franchises. Now, horror is falling into this trap as well, but especially indie horror like A23 and Blumhouse, etc., are doing more experimental stuff, even though they are also dabbling in, to pay the bills, franchises and reboots, etc., because they have to make money. That's always been the name of the game. If you don't make money, your shit don't get made. So I think the renaissance of horror started around 2009-ish. That's my estimation. Now, this final topic, I'm actually going to save for another video because it's going to probably take too long to dive into it. And it was going to be, just for your information, death as a character, or the Grim Reaper, or a representation of death as a character in horror. And obviously, the example that comes to mind is Final Destination, but that warrants a whole discussion, probably a whole video, maybe a franchise video on the Final Destination franchise. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off the docket. And I was also going to get into horror cartoons, but I'm going to shy away from that because, one, I don't watch cartoons, so I don't have the frame of reference to treat them fairly. I tried to do that with anime last week, and I'm going to be honest, I failed because I only have 2 examples of anime horror, and they both suck. So, and they're both 30 years old at this point, so I I don't feel like I'm qualified to talk about anime and horror. Likewise, I'm not qualified to talk about cartoons or horror in animation, horror cartoons, etc. So there is that. As far as housekeeping goes, once again, I'm going to say go to patreon.com/StephanieBree, donate, and you can get some perks. Go to amazon.com and search for my book, Goldfish on the Mountain. It's a horror thriller. You might like it, hopefully. And find me on Twitter at StephanieBree22. Also, if you like my work and just want to throw me a bone, maybe a couple bucks or whatever, Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App. My handle is StephanieBree22, the same as it is Twitter. So, hey, if you like my work and want to support me financially, stay cool. Thank you. Bye.